Hello and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. This is Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink, and this is the first episode in our new series, FRIGHT LITE, Non-Horror Horror Films.
Okay, so Jeremy, first of all, welcome back.
Yes, it's been a while. Welcome
Everyone,
back
welcome back. Yeah, thank you. There's really no rhyme or reason to when we record this show. It's, it's kind of just on the fly. It's kind of like we'll just hit each other up and say, hey, I have an idea for a series or something like that. So that's kind of what happened with this, and I'm sure we've both been busy since the last time. Mm-hmm. But if you are a regular listener to the show and you're still with us, I do want to say thank you for tuning back in. And if you're a new listener, welcome to the cult. Mm-hmm. So thanks for checking us out. We're just two filmmakers who discuss strange and bizarre, or less seen films, right?
Yeah, well, a mix, you know.
A mix, yeah, there's a mix. Some a little more mainstream. But
the other side of cinema.
The other side, yeah.
Yeah.
It's films that have some kind of cult following, and we would be remiss to even have this show and not talk about the film we're going to talk about today, Eraserhead, a film by David Lynch from 1977. And this film, Jeremy, I've been wanting to talk about it since the very beginning. It's one of my all-time favorite films. Mm-hmm. David Lynch is one of my all-time, if not my favorite director of all time. Mm-hmm. So this was certainly one that I wanted to get to, and that's why we had tossed around different movies we wanted to talk about for the series, for FRIGHT LITE non-horror horror films. And this one was just at the forefront. I said, we got to do it. Let's dive right in with Eraserhead. So, Jeremy, let's start with you. So what are your, I guess, experiences with this film? Because it really is an experience of a film. When did you first see it? How did you see it? Or, whatever you want to talk about with it. Yeah,
so like you, Mark, David Lynch was really instrumental in me kind of getting deep into movies in the first place. Yeah. I always kind of liked movies, but it wasn't until Blue Velvet was the first one I saw, where I went to art school, so seeing Blue Velvet, I was like going to art museums and galleries and seeing all this really radical artwork. And for me, movies, the kind of movies I was watching didn't feel like they had that level of, ideological sophistication, abstraction, fearlessness, because I was mostly watching, mainstream movies, which there's nothing wrong with mainstream movies, but, for my personal tastes. And then I stumbled across Blue Velvet, and it just totally blew my mind, because I was like, oh, this is the same thing these gallery artists are doing, except it's a movie. That's the coolest thing in the world.
Exactly.
And then, so as soon as I had watched Blue Velvet, I basically had a David Lynch-a-thon, and had to just plow through as much of his filmography, including all of Twin Peaks that was out at the time.
Yep.
This is before The Return, but
right.
as much of it as I could.
Well.
Yeah. And so obviously one of those movies was Eraserhead, and it was to me definitely when I watched Eraserhead, I had seen Blue Velvet and Mulholland Drive, and Eraserhead was kind of a big leap of faith, because those other movies, while they are abstract, at least you're in a pretty straightforward story for until a certain point. And Eraserhead was Eraserhead, obviously Mulholland Drive has some sections that are pretty darn abstract, but you're at least not right away thrust into it. And Eraserhead was one of the first movies that I saw that just kind of embraced abstraction wholeheartedly. Like, there are things in this movie that make no sense, but for me personally, it was one of the first experiences I had where that was really exciting to me in a movie. I at no point in watching it was I sitting there upset because it didn't make sense, because I was just so absorbed in the feeling, in the tone.
Absorbed. That's a good word. It's like you have to kind of give yourself over to it.
Yeah.
And with David Lynch movies, I feel like with all of them really, there's that surface level which you mentioned with which Blue Velvet definitely has, and Mulholland Drive and some of his other films, but really there's always that other level, at least one other level,
at least one. Sometimes many more,
and even that opening to we're not going to talk about Blue Velvet too much, but that opening to Blue Velvet where you see the idyllic suburban neighborhood, and then the camera you sort of sink down and you go sort of beneath the ground, and you're seeing the worms and the everything underneath, and to me that is like quintessential David Lynch. Like that's what he does, so but yeah, it sounds like you had a similar experience to me with seeing Eraserhead, because I think I had seen Mulholland Drive, because at the time, and I wasn't even really aware of David Lynch at the time. It was some friends that said, "Yo, you got to check out this weird movie." It was like one of the, okay. So we would watch it, and that was crazy. Like, but I was into it, and I was like, I have to see more. Like, I just had to see more. And I think it was my younger brother. He had a copy of Eraserhead. Of course, appropriately, it was on like some Japanese import VHS or something at the time, because I don't know if people realize now how hard it was to actually see some
things like
movies
this
back then, because I think even at that time, which it wasn't even that long ago, but up until pretty recently, there was not really like a definitive print of Eraserhead to even watch, until eventually it did come out on DVD and Blu-ray and all of that.
Which is funny because there are probably a lot of people, I mean, we can get into the story, but Eraserhead's not, like a lot of things we talk about on this podcast, it's not really a story movie.
Usually not.
You talk about the emotions, the images, but it's funny because thinking about that, there are probably a lot of people out there who think that Eraserhead is a kind of cheap, grainy, like not ugly necessarily, but because it's kind of, when we talk about cult movies, a lot of people probably watch this on beat up VHS tapes or weird internet rips. And like didn't, because watching it now, like I watched Eraserhead for this podcast on Criterion. I watched it on the Criterion channel, and the print was gorgeous. And that was one thing that I've seen it before. I've seen it a few times, but watching it today, one thing that I was just so impressed with was just what a beautifully photographed movie this is, and of course that contributes. Contributes so much to this feeling we talk about of being absorbed and giving yourself over to it. It's right away from that opening shot of the kind of, I don't know what we call it. I've always thought of it as a kind of meteor, whatever that, but it's never really totally explained. It's something in the radiator, but that opening shot with Jack Nance, who plays our main character Henry, with his head, and it's just like, the lighting, the framing is just immaculate in every single scene in this movie. It's really incredible.
The cinematography by Herbert Cardwell and Frederick Elms, just phenomenal. And that's so funny, Jeremy, that you bring up the grainy factor, the graininess, because in my head, honestly, up until I had even, I guess, got it on Blu-ray, the Criterion, in my head, this movie was always grainy, right? And it's probably just because of the way I watched it, which did add to the experience in a certain way. I do have to say, the VHS.
It's its own thing.
But it's its own thing. But it's a certain aesthetic. But either way, I think the movie is really beautiful. The way it's shot and but I was so surprised to see how pristine everything looked, and how you really see the intricacy that Lynch had with each shot, because the film did take literally years to make. It was his first feature film. He had made short films before it. Okay, well, now I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me go back real quick to when I first watched the movie. I do want to talk about all of that. We're going to get to it. But anyway, so first time I saw it, like I said, was on that VHS. And Jeremy, like you, I had seen, I'd seen a little bit of his work, and I was into movies. Like, I always loved movies as a kid or whatever. But when I saw this film, there was something about it. I was probably in my early 20s. Maybe I was probably around 20 or something like that. And I saw this film, and it just, something changed. Like, something happened. And it was like, I want to do that. Like, I want to... This was instrumental in me wanting to be a filmmaker. One of, I would say, probably several films, but... this one was at the forefront for me. Like, when I saw this, it was like, it really was like opening a portal to another world. Like, you mentioned like the opening to this film, and it felt like that it just completely blew my mind. So it had a huge impact and a huge influence on me as a filmmaker. And I think my first feature I made was essentially, there were scenes that were essentially ripped off from this. I think I made a couple of shorts that were kind of like pseudo Eraserhead, wannabe. But this movie just blew my mind. Opened up a world of possibilities of what you could do with film, and what a movie could be. Because to me, it was like, oh, you have like a basic plot and a premise and blah blah blah. But this was just so experimental. Like the experimental nature of it, and how bizarre everything was, and the surreal imagery, and the sound, which I definitely want to talk about, because that almost gets overlooked sometimes when people discuss this film. But that's a huge part of it. So all of that together, it really had a profound effect on me. I probably watched it late at night too. That was that probably helped. It's just like the overall experience of it, and I just always go back to that as like kind of the defining moment of when I wanted to actually get into film and try to do things like David Lynch was doing, because I just thought it was so cool.
I would though, not to counter that, but to elaborate, I feel like you could watch this film at 11 in the morning and you would still be watching it late at night. It's just that you just that kind of movie. Yeah, it's like you just are so lost in it. It's whatever time it is in the movie is when you're watching it.
No, for sure. Yeah, I saw it at a drive-in actually. Pretty recently, and even that experience was like its own thing, and it was just so cool. Just seeing it, and it was projected on film and all of that. So, really, any way you see this movie, I mean, even if you watch it on, I mean, I don't even know if it's on YouTube, but any way you can find this movie, no matter how you watch it, I think it will have some sort of an effect on you, even if it's not completely your thing. I think you might. Again, if you're listening to the show, you'll probably enjoy what you're seeing in some way. Well, enjoy might not be the right word, but it'll be fascinating, and
it'll be an experience.
It'll be an experience. It'll take hold of you for sure.
Yeah. So let's before we dig to, and let's jump back and do what we can in terms of talking through story, just in case there's anyone who's.
Well, let's give a little background.
In case there's maybe anyone like we always recommend watching these movies ahead of time before listening. There's our podcast is filled with spoilers, and it's meant to be a dialogue about something you've already experienced. But just in case there's anyone who's watched this for the first time and is maybe just totally baffled, which
could happen.
We'll try to give it a little bit of framing. So essentially, the story follows a young man named Henry. The film is, in interviews I've heard, was shot in shot at AFI, but based on David Lynch's experience of Philadelphia. This very kind of industrial landscape, a little depressed, but it essentially follows this young man named Henry who is in a relationship, or a kind of a pseudo relationship. It's hard to exactly identify it, but with his girlfriend Mary X, and he's invited to go to dinner with her and her family, and basically that night at dinner, Mary's mother reveals to Henry that Mary is not pregnant, but has had a child.
She's had a child.
She's had a child, unbeknownst to Henry, and Henry is now responsible for caring for the child. I don't know, Mark. What do you think? Is that like?
Well, it's the film is so abstract. I mean that's pretty close. It's that's basically what the film is. It's
to parse it down.
It's this man sort of dealing with these different anxieties, I guess, these emotions. Because to me, the film's just all an allegory for. I believe Lynch I think he was a new father at the time when he was at least, I don't know when he was writing the film or making the film, or it all happened around the same time. So I think there's definitely like insecurities there, and anxieties and fear and all of that put into this. I guess like you said, the story revolves around this infant, this baby, and the baby is it presented in the film as a bit of a monstrosity. It's almost like a creature, and there's different stories out there about what the baby actually is, like what they use for the baby. Personally, I think it's just like a puppet or something like that, but there are some wild theories out there about what they actually use. Like I don't even know if I want to get into it, but different animal parts.
Do your own research and come up with your own theory.
If you again, but that adds to the mystery, right? Like stories like that. But that's the basic premise, Jeremy.
Well, and apparently, and there's a lot of lore surrounding this movie. You know, in a lot of stories, we don't know how many of them are true or not true. That's kind of the beauty of a film. Especially a film made in that time that's made so independently, when there was much less of an independent film scene, is that there's not a lot of documentation of the process. You know, it was a small crew. There's really probably only, you know, and now, you know, a few people have passed away, so there's even less who actually know what was going on that set. Who
actually know. Right.
You know.
And I think more recently, I was going to touch on this later, but more recently, David Lynch has spoken about the making of this film and other films, which he didn't used to do. Like he would really not speak on his films at all, which I want to talk about more later. But some light has been shed on it. And you mentioned Philadelphia. I think he only lived there for a short amount of time. Yeah. And I've lived in Philadelphia, so just like I've seen the areas where he lived, and they're still kind of like that. And I could see where, you know, how images of this film would arise from that. I forget if he actually filmed any of it in Philly. I think most of it was in California, but definitely inspired by his time staying in Philadelphia when he lived there, and the fear he felt. I guess it was very violent at the time. And, you know, the fear he felt just being in his apartment or when he would walk down the street. These are the kinds of things that would fester in his mind and eventually made its way into this film. And as I said, he had made a couple of short films which were very experimental in nature. Definitely check those out if you get a chance, because those are really cool to see. They're very short. But this was his first feature film, Eraserhead, and he enlisted the talents of a lot of I think they were mostly like art students, friends of his. And of course we can't talk about them without mentioning Jack Nance, who is sort of like, you know, he's like the stalwart. He's in a lot of Lynch's films. He's always a bit player, or at least up until his death. But he's the main actor in this film. And what do you think of his performance in this? Curious to hear what you think, Jeremy.
Oh, I love Jack Nance in this. I think he's just I couldn't think of a better person.
Oh, he's so perfect
to play the role. Like, you know, there's just some, you know, in the history of cinema, there's just those characters that are paired with the right actor. And this is one of them. You know, it's like I don't think there is an Eraserhead without Jack Nance is just perfect. You know, it's like you can't beat it for this character.
He's an everyman, but he's like so quirky and eccentric.
Because I think that's kind of the difficult thing, you know, as a filmmaker and as a writer, that I've definitely come across, and I think a lot of people come across, is when you're doing something where you have a character that isn't necessarily given a lot of backstory, given a lot of dialogue. It's hard to create a unique character. It's a real challenge. It can kind of become this thing where, you know, when you want to explore the idea of an everyman or an everywoman, you know, it can become very trope driven. It can become very generic, very stock. And I think, obviously, you know, all the elements that played into this, from, you know, cinematography, the really, you know, production design, wardrobe, everything played into this character. But I think a huge amount of it is just the tenderness and the neurosis that Jack Nance brought to the table for this character that made him feel distinctly his own. Yeah,
he takes what is essentially a silent performance and really just I think what he does with it is pretty amazing. Just even in his eyes and in his face. You could even just watch him for an entire movie, I feel like, which is pretty much what you're doing with this movie, but also all this other surreal and nightmarish imagery that we're going to get to in a bit.
Just sorry to interrupt, but just one quick Jack Nance thing that I was thinking of, which I think just perfectly summed up. It was one little moment in the movie. It's relatively early on, when he's just gone to Mary's parents' house, and he's sitting there talking.
That's a good scene.
Yeah, he's it's one scene where he's sitting on the couch next to Mary, and he's talking to Mary's father, and Mary
chickens.
Chickens.
When he's talking about the chickens,
little damn things.
Little damn things.
But Mary, all of a sudden, mid-conversation, kind of starts convulsing for no reason. And there's this great Jack Nance moment where he kind of shifts his eyes a little bit. They're talking about printing and how he works in printing. And he kind of just shifts his eyes for a moment, sees that she's convulsing hysterically, then just keeps talking about printing. And it was such a, I was like, that's the performance right there. He gave just enough where we understand and we relate, and we get that he understands that this environment and world he's living in is a little strange, but he's also part of it. He's not.
But he's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. He's not removed from it. He's in it just enough, but he's also just gives us just enough kind of basic normal human sanity that he's the one we follow and can see through his eyes. And I thought that moment just captured it so perfectly.
Yeah, he's our straight man. Like this.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, it's like you do wonder how much of the film is improvised too. Like I did always wonder that.
Who knows?
Because I feel like I don't know, but they, back when they were using film, it was I guess a little bit harder, more expensive to do improv. But yeah, some moments like that are just they feel like almost like he's like or maybe he came up with it right before they shot or something, something like that. But anyway, yeah, I love those little moments in the film, and that's a great scene that you mentioned when he meets the parents for the first time. But yeah, Jack Nance, I wanted to say another thing about him. So this actor he didn't really do much. He was in the Twin Peaks series and, like I said, a lot of Lynch's films, and he showed up in some other things, mostly like bit parts. But he was a man who was so eccentric and interesting that he was a subject of a documentary, actually. I don't know if you knew about this, Jeremy, but it's called You Don't Know. Yeah, it's called You Don't Know Jack.
Oh, and yeah, I think I have heard of it. It came out,
I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, something like that. But David Lynch does speak in it about him and their relationship, their friendship that they had together, because they really started out together. Like, Jack Nance he began acting the same time that Lynch began directing. So they kind of came up together, and it was sad that he did have an early death. But typically Jack Nance, it was a very mysterious death, shrouded in a lot of sort of, again, it's like the making of Eraserhead. There's lots of stories about it, and no one really knows what happened. Something about he was outside of a donut shop, and someone threw a donut at his head, and the next moment he ended up on the floor dead. That's all I've read about it, really. But obviously there's more to it than that. But again, he just has one of those like very peculiar Hollywood deaths that's very strange. And not to laugh at but just like the circumstances of it are just very Jack Nance. And he's one of those men that will just like always remain a mystery, much like Lynch will, I think. So
yeah, he also interesting. Yeah. Just another Jack Nance fact that I'm finding is he was actually married for a while to Catherine E. Coulson, who for the David Lynch fans out there is Log Lady from Twin Peaks.
Lady, who also just passed away, sadly.
Yeah, Log Lady, and she was also in one of David Lynch's early short films, The Amputee.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's I think
so
David Lynch. Yeah, he kind of could attract these people who just had such a specific vibe. They just had
for sure. Yeah, it's like his troupe, his players. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, that's what it was. It was almost like this troupe of almost like theater people that came together. They weren't really theater people, but just that kind of vibe of create, because they had to create the sets, and they had to make their own environments for a lot of the scenes, and create costumes and props and makeup and all of that. So and we'll definitely get to the makeup in a bit too when we speak about the lady and the radiator. So David Lynch, he's someone again that we've brought up a lot on the show. So being able to dive into a Lynch film is great. But I do want to just give a little bit of a just at the top, not the top of the show anymore, but in the middle of the show.
Sorry if this one is a little nonlinear, as you might be able to tell. Yeah. Mark and I are both very excited about this movie.
Yeah, probably way too excited. To
a little giddy and a little prone to distraction. So apologies.
Yeah. Well, that's mostly the show anyway. So
that's true.
Our digressions, but. So, yes, at the middle of the show, I'd like to bring up that in discussing David Lynch, I do want to say that I tread lightly. And here's why. Because I was just discussing this with my brother, who I mentioned earlier, who, he's another film guy. He's really into David Lynch's films as well. And we've been discussing, because he had mentioned something to me about, I guess now there's like a lot of people, with the internet, like people cropping up, trying to really dissect his films and find the definitive meaning in each of his films and things like that. And I don't know, I feel like people that watch his films and try to fully understand everything that they're experiencing, because again, it is an experience, at least to me, like a surreal sort of dream. that's, to me, that's not really the point, or at least that's not David Lynch's concern. His concern is getting whatever is in his brain out there, in some form. And actually, he's done painting for the last, I don't know, at least probably like 20 years at least. But actually,
he was a painter first.
He was right. I'm sorry. Yeah, and even in college, because I've actually seen some of his work in person, which was really cool in Philadelphia, where he went to school actually. He was a painter, is a painter, and he definitely approaches film with that painterly eye and very impressionistic and very sort of dreamlike. And I've heard Lynch himself speak of this on many occasions, many interviews. And I was actually lucky enough to see him in person being interviewed.
Oh, cool.
They showed Lost Highway in Philadelphia at a theater there, and he came and spoke, and one of the things that he always talks about is that because he's often asked the meaning of his films and what does it mean, things like that, and he seems to reiterate the same notion that his films are like dreams, and that dreams mean different things to different people. So and again, for a while he wouldn't even really discuss his films. He would not provide commentaries when director commentaries were a common thing. When DVDs were the media that was most prolific, and directors and filmmakers and all cast members, everyone wanted to do a commentary track, but David Lynch refused to. He refused to even put chapter selections on his films. And that's part of the reason, because he just, for him, it's he would like to leave the interpretation up to the viewer. And he's okay with vagueness, which I agree with. That's like one of my favorite things about him as a filmmaker. And just letting things kind of be, like presenting them and not over explaining or not even trying to explain them. But in a certain way you still kind of get it, and maybe it makes you, maybe you do watch it again or another time or a fourth time, but again, everything's there. He presents them as they are in his head, and but I don't know, how do you feel about that, Jeremy? That's just my take on it, but
it works for me with David Lynch. I think it's always dicey territory when you see a filmmaker.
Not every filmmaker is like that, for sure.
Because some filmmakers, I think they'll kind of use the "I'm leaving it up to interpretation" thing as a little bit of a cop out. If sometimes but I think it really depends on the kind of movie, because I think if someone's doing something where they're really leaning into abstraction and want something to really be organic, then I think that's fair. I think sometimes you get into something where there's maybe just a piece of a movie that's not landing.
It's clearly different when you watch like a Christopher Nolan movie or something like that, where it's clearly very intricately plotted and everything like that.
Well, I think it also just depends on, honestly, kind of you don't want to be too harsh with filmmakers, and my philosophy is that every movie is a miracle in and of itself, and there are no bad movies. There are just movies that
the fact that anything gets made is amazing.
There's no bad movies. There's just movies that work for you or don't work for you. But I think that there's David Lynch has a level of competency. He's so talented in how he constructs his films that it doesn't matter as much. He's able to say, I want you to just interpret it and do what you want with it, because he's so skilled. He's so technically skilled. He's so skilled at creating interesting images, interesting characters, that he kind of, in my mind, gets a little bit of a pass. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing to do that, but like, it doesn't bother me because I know that he's actually putting the thought and time into it. It never feels like he's saying that because he's just done something on a whim. And
he's not arbitrarily doing so. Exactly. You're in good hands when you're watching these films.
Even if because I know he talks a lot about meditation, and I'd like to plug, just because I really enjoyed it, there's a great documentary called The Art Life, David Lynch, The Art Life,
transcendental.
And he talks a lot about his process in this documentary, kind of way more, and his life growing up, way more than I had ever heard him talk about it before. So if you're a David Lynch fan and you haven't seen The Art Life,
is that a more recent?
It came out maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about. Okay,
it's terrific. It's great. But it's one of those things where, like, he pulls a lot of images from his meditation, but it's not like he's just pulling the images from his meditation and then saying, okay, that's good enough. You really get the sense that he's using those images that he's pulling from his meditations and dreams as jumping off point to build something cinematic.
Yeah. It's what can I do with these images?
What can I do with it? Exactly. It's not just, and that was something, for me early on when I, and I think there's an interesting thing, every director, and I know we're going on a little bit of a tangent here, but, I think David Lynch would appreciate a tangent. But, whenever you get into a director who has a really, really strong style and a really strong fingerprint, whether it be, David Lynch or Jordan Peele or Tarantino, just someone who has their own thing, and you're a young director and you start making your own stuff, and you start pulling from them, it's great because you're going to learn their style, but there are also certain pitfalls that you can get into. And I know for me early on directing, I was really into David Lynch, and I got really into this idea of, you're meditating, you're pulling from dreams, and I think early on I kind of didn't understand how much work he put into building up the ideas, into not just having the idea in the image, but to really crafting it. And I think it's I think people talk a lot about David Lynch as someone who's abstract, but what kind of can get overlooked is just how refined his work is, how polished his work is.
I think he is meticulous in a certain way. I agree. I think in his own, again, in a painterly way, just like a painting is intricate in its own way. I think he brings that approach to film. Yeah. So I definitely agree with you. I think what I didn't mean to say that he wasn't intentional with what he did. I think 100%. I think he is, but I think in terms of interpretation, I think he really does want to leave that to the audience. I don't think it's. I know what you're saying about a cop out, but I don't think with him. It never. He's just such an artist. Yeah, it never feels that way with him. And if you've seen one or two or any of his films, I think you can get that right away. Yeah. Because there's always something different about them, and you mentioned Tarantino and and Jordan Peele. So like these directors that have a certain style to them, they're few and far between, and you don't really see as many of the auteurs. You do. Jeremy, you had mentioned that one filmmaker who I forget her name now, but she makes films that are intricately 60s horror films. Yeah,
her name it's Anna Biller. Yeah.
Right. So there's another
who's
example.
Great. Check her out for sure. Definitely check her out.
So another example, and they're still out there, but Lynch for me has always been 100% David Lynch. It's like you can't even and people try to emulate him, and sometimes they're more successful or not, but there's only one of him. Yeah. So that's why nobody else could have made Twin Peaks: The Return, and I was very, once I heard that he was on board and he was coming back for that
and directing every episode.
That's when I strapped in. I was like, all right, we're really doing this, and he did not disappoint. If any listeners out there have seen the older Twin Peaks or have not seen the older Twin Peaks, either way, check out The Return. It is phenomenal. So we mentioned imagery a lot, and I definitely want to touch on a couple of specific images. Because the whole focus of the series is, films that are not categorized as horror films, but have a lot of horrific elements to them, or in this case, imagery and sound, which we're going to get to in a bit. But let's focus on imagery right now, Jeremy. Do any scenes or any particular images stick out to you as particularly horrific in this film, or even unsettling? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of that, but just anything that comes to mind.
Well, there are a ton, and I know, Mark, before we got on, you mentioned that this movie is funnier than you remember, which is true.
I want to touch on that too.
We'll touch on that, but for the sake of this, what we're talking about this non-horror movie as a horror movie, and so I think the first thing that comes to mind is the most obvious one that's going to come to mind for most people, which is that the baby. I'm going to pick something. It's kind of a smaller moment in the film, in terms of it's not the one you always are kind of seeing that people go back to, but there's a character who I think is just known as, in the credits, is just called like good looking woman across the hall, or something like that. The neighbor. But there's one scene near the end of the film where she basically comes over and is telling Henry that she's, I believe, locked out of her apartment and needs a place to spend the night, and there's just this one shot of her where she just comes out of the darkness, which is interesting because in Blue Velvet there's a really similar shot when the Laura Dern character is introduced. But this shot where she kind of comes out of the darkness, and the shot is just so underexposed. You know, like, you can hardly see her, especially in black and white like that. And I don't know why. That's always just been an image and a feeling that's really, really stuck with me, because you normally don't see a shot that's just that dark outside of a horror movie. You know, like I guess maybe in The Godfather or something like that, but like, yeah, Mark, I don't know if you can think of other examples, but
for sure that there's probably like so many examples. The way that Lynch plays with dark and light throughout all his films, like his entire career, is just phenomenal. Like, you know, I feel like he's I don't know. Yeah, I feel like he's gotten every angle of like that kind of the not only the relationship between light and dark, but the actual imagery of light and dark. Like, you see so much of it with the flickering lights. There's a lot of that in maybe like the newer Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive and things like that. And there's some of that here too. But yeah, even just shots like you mentioned, Jeremy, which I'm glad you brought that up, because that's not a shot that many people would normally think of or would go to right away for the horrific tone that we're going for. But to me, yeah, there's something so foreboding about that. I know what shot you're talking about, and because I think it takes her a long time to like emerge from the darkness.
Yeah, it's very slow, and you kind of, you know, it's not uncommon. You know, David Lynch definitely watched a lot of old Hollywood movies, and it's not uncommon to introduce a character by having them step out of the darkness. But I think what for me with that shot, it's that she steps out of the darkness, but she never really steps into the light. She just moves out of the darkness enough where you can see that she's there, and it's just so weird. It's so in between. It's
like he brings it to the extreme of that idea of the character emerging into the light. Because like you said, she doesn't even fully emerge into the light. She's sort of hidden in shadows and the dark still, which again, I guess, you know, and you could dive into that. What does it mean? And it could mean a lot of things about her character or what she represents in the story. Sort of like the dark side, maybe calling out to Henry, or again, up for interpretation. So I don't want to get too much into actual interpretations, but you know, I'm going to be a little boring with my choice because this is probably an obvious one, Jeremy, but for horrific imagery at least, the lady in the radiator has always creeped me out. There's something about, you know, if the listener hasn't seen it, first of all, please watch the film if you haven't.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it and you're still listening, you are patient,
please.
Because you are so confused right now.
You're probably so confused.
Yeah.
But also just do yourself a favor and watch this film. But anyway, so there's a character called the Lady in the Radiator, and we don't really know anything about her, or nothing is explicitly said about her other than she's a woman that lives in the radiator.
Yeah.
And she has this makeup that's is sort of like her cheeks are puffed out, but they sort of look hardened, and I don't know if it's just a type of makeup that, or I'm not sure what was used for that. But,
no clue.
Yeah, again, it's like shrouded in mystery, all this stuff. But and there are also, you know, tales from beyond the set that said that maybe I don't know if the actress was actually I don't know if she had like a skin irritation or something happened to her skin because of this makeup. I'm not sure if that's actually true or not. Who knows? Yeah. But anyway, so this image of this woman, and she's sort of, you know, we talk about dark and light, and she's sort of bathed in light in a lot of it. She's in like this big spotlight, and she kind of moves in and out of it, and does this very strange dance step thing, kind of moving back and forth while she's stepping on these, I don't know what they are exactly, slugs or bugs or something like that.
Yeah, who knows?
And yes, and she's also, you know, just kind of smiling, and for some reason the smile is like the creepiest, most, you know, unsettling thing you could see. And you know, it's all very dreamlike, and there's of course a song that eventually comes along with the imagery where we're in heaven, everything is fine, and with that sort of high-pitched voice, and just the combination of all those things for me has always sort of, I guess, creeped me out. I don't know how else to say it. And so with all the dark imagery, it's kind of funny that, like, you know, it's one of the brighter shots in the movie, but because it's so bright and so in your face, you know, the makeup is just so strange, and this character is so strange. So something about that just always, you know, freaked me out a little bit. And also, you know, and that does combine the music and the soundtrack as well, which I wanted to get into. So that's a good segue there, I guess. Yeah, because the soundtrack, the not just the soundtrack, the soundscape, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the sound design. Well, yeah, the combination.
The sound design.
Yeah, sound design, sound, everything sound-wise.
Yeah, the mix from the mixing of it to just the sounds they used, the Foley sounds and every like the ambient sounds. Oh, this movie is so ambient. The even scenes where Henry's just walking around and he's outside and you wouldn't expect her to be like this kind of like this odd ambient buzz. It's like an industrial, a lot of industrial themes in this film for sure. I guess that goes back to the area that Lynch lived in Philly, but I don't know. What are your thoughts about the sounds of Eraserhead?
Well, it's weird because it's a very quiet film, but also a very loud film. Like
there are moments that are very quiet.
Yeah, because it's like quiet in terms of that it's not like the diegetic sound, the sounds that are actually happening. You don't hear every footstep that a character takes. You don't hear every movement. So it's kind of quiet in that sense that it's not like from a realistic perspective. It's not designed in the way that we would normally associate movie sound design. Normally if a character walks across a space, you hear every footstep. If they move, you hear clothing rustle, and like you don't hear everything in this. But it's filled with like you said, like ambience. Like all kinds of if a window's open, we don't gently hear the wind. The wind is blasting.
It's like gusting,
in the room. Like any opportunity for to push some kind of, which I think is a lot of what lends itself to the feeling of horror movie.
Like unsettling almost. And that disconnection, like you said, I didn't even think about that, but when sometimes people are walking and you don't hear their footsteps, or or you do in certain parts, it's like they're very, it's almost like they really picked and chose when they wanted to have certain sounds come in and be heard. And whether they did that for budget reasons or whatever, it works. I think it adds to the overall feeling of it. Very unsettling, a lot of it. Yeah. Which again just adds it to the creepy vibe of it. Yeah,
and I think it can't be like we have to look at how influential this movie is to horror movies as a non-horror movie, because I think
experimental film and horror.
Yeah, experimental film, but specifically, talking about in this series, non-horror horror movies, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a horror movie that's coming out today that in some way is not influenced by the sound design in Eraserhead. That kind of ambient approach, because you look at horror movies pre-Eraserhead, and one movie which we've talked about, Carnival of Souls, I know is actually a big influence on Eraserhead, and David Lynch loves that movie, which that kind of fits. I mean, I guess that's more of a horror movie, but kind of also could fit into this category.
There's a through line there.
Sure. But other than that, you look at the kind of soundscapes that were present in most horror movies around that time. And the big thing was, how Hitchcock did Psycho, and these kind of really intense strings and, kind of jolting score. And then you have Lynch come through with Eraserhead. And then, through the 80s, horror movies are filled with ambience. They're filled with droning sounds and wind. And it continues right to this day. I mean, you think about, and I think about like Robert Eggers, who, I don't know if he would consider himself a horror filmmaker or not. But, I would say his films are definitely horror films, or Ari Aster, or, a lot of the kind of big horror filmmakers from today, and particularly a film like The Lighthouse, is just so inspired by Eraserhead. Like I know in The Lighthouse they have that foghorn that's just blasting every 8 seconds through the entire movie that just becomes ambience, and that's equivalent to, in my mind, equivalent to wind in Eraserhead, or equivalent to buzzing. It's like it's right there.
Yeah. For sure, yeah. I think it's had tons of influence, and even though it's a cult film, I think, if you're a filmmaker, I almost feel like you not to say you need to watch this movie, but you kind of have to. You kind of have to watch Eraserhead at least once in your life. You have to experience it. If you're interested in film, I think even objectively, it's just an interesting film to watch. So I actually remember what I was going to say, Jeremy. I was going to say that it's rare. We're talking about the blending of horror film and cult film, and now there are plenty of cult films that are horror films, but you don't see many cult films like Eraserhead that are just so artfully done, so experimental, where it's almost like an art house film, but also it has that I don't want to say camp, I don't want to say that word, but
it's not necessarily camp, but it's that off kilter.
Off kilter.
You know the perfect term is we talk you hear it more in the art world, but it feels like a piece of outsider art. It doesn't feel like a thing that is made for. I mean honestly, it doesn't even really feel like a thing that's made for an audience. As weird as that sounds, it kind of feels like it was just made. It kind of feels like it was made just to explore something for the artist.
Yeah,
and that's why it's so organic and.
It definitely feels very personal for sure.
And kind of transcends camp. It kind of transcends camp. Like it doesn't, because there's and there's plenty of ruminations on camp and what camp means and where the line is drawn. But it doesn't feel like at any time this movie is really, at least to me, everyone has different opinions. Someone might watch it and feel the exact opposite. But it doesn't. Eraserhead, the thing I love about it and what's so hard to do with this kind of movie. It doesn't feel like it's trying to be weird. It doesn't feel.
That's the thing, Jeremy. Because I feel like a lot of and it's great to be influenced by this film for sure. But I think when you lean into it so heavily, and maybe you're not, maybe the filmmaker isn't even aware of it, but I have seen instances of it where it does feel a bit forced. Which I still appreciate it because I understand what they're going for. Yeah. But it's hard. It's a hard line for sure.
I mean, making movies is hard. It's really hard, and sometimes you try something, but
like we always say, like making movies is hard, and so it's a hard line. But I think Lynch, because maybe he was like the first or whatever you want to say, not the first experimental filmmaker, but he was the first. The Eraserhead is one of a kind. So when you're the first,
the first David Lynch.
You're the archetype. So
because filmmakers since 1977 when this movie came out could hit a wall and say, all right, what would David Lynch do? But David Lynch couldn't. David Lynch couldn't hit a wall and say, "What would David Lynch do?" He, maybe he was saying, "What would Ingmar Bergman do?" or something like that.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
But
so that's. I mean, again, actually, for a time, I'd used an image from this movie. I was just going through images of the film, and I saw an image of the scene when Henry's head is replaced by the baby's head. When he's standing on the balcony in the theater, and I had actually used that image for our show for a while.
I remember that.
Because to me that just kind of stood out as like a cult movie image. So now we've discussed a lot about this film, and I just want to end by delving into what you brought up a little bit earlier, and we were talking about before we recorded, about how the film is very funny. There's a lot of humor in it, and I think mostly intentional. I mean, I could be wrong, but there's something about the humor in the film that seems like they were going for a laugh, and you kind of need it in a way because it does alleviate some of the tension. Yeah. And the way it's done is still quirky and strange. So it's not really, I wouldn't say it's totally breaking, the mystique of the film or anything like that. If anything, it adds to it. Yeah. And I think further pushes it into that cult territory.
Absolutely.
Almost camp territory that we were talking about.
Yeah. There's this one great moment where Henry kind of comes into the room and his little kid's been kind of coughing, but he's not sure what's going on. And then he just goes, "Oh, you are sick," and it just cuts to the little baby, and the baby has like warts all over it, and you get this like dun, like this very like dun 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 kind of thing, and it's in an almost kind of cheesy dramatic horror movie way, and it's really funny. It's scary because it's a horrific image, but it's really funny, and I don't think that
melodramatic.
Yeah, like a moment like that, I feel like David Lynch and everyone else working on that had to understand that was funny. You know what I mean? Like there was a knowledge, but it was never, it was never a joke where they were pushing a joke. They just kind of let it be funny. And that's the thing, what I love about Lynch is that he is funny, and a lot of my favorite directors are very dark but have moments of humor. And I remember I had, to give a little anecdote, I had the first time I watched Blue Velvet, I remember just coming away with the feeling, oh, that was so intense. That was so serious. That was such a brutal movie. And a lot of the first watch for me of most David Lynch movies, I didn't really see the humor in them, just because
they are intense.
Because they're really intense, and it almost gets easy to forget. I remember one time I took my girlfriend to see Blue Velvet, and I hadn't watched it in a long time. And in my mind, it's this quirky David Lynch movie, and you kind of forget how disturbing it is. And she was like, "What is this?" But
Yeah.
but
I
there
know
was
exactly what you mean.
I had one experience though. So the first time I saw Blue Velvet was on my own at home, but the second time I saw it was in a theater, and so I had this memory of it. It'd probably been like 6 months or a year since I had seen it for the first time, and I had this memory of it being this really serious movie, and I'm in the theater, and you know there are parts that people are laughing at, you know, like the way the characters are talking, the kind of uncomfortable pauses. And at first I started kind of almost getting upset because I'm like, why are you laughing at a David Lynch movie? Like this is high art cinema. And then by the end, you know, like as I really kind of forced me to open myself up to it, because I'm like, well, you're in an audience and you have to move with the audience. It's not worth it trying to fight an audience in a theater. You should try to connect. And by the end, watching it for a second time, I was like, oh, like, yeah, there are some brutal moments in this, but this is also hilarious. And the more, for me, the more you go back to David Lynch movies, what's so fun is that they become funny over time the more you watch them. And also for me, just, you know, as I get a little older and, you know, you come across different experiences in your life and maybe your worldview shifts a little bit and you're able to appreciate things that maybe wouldn't have been funny to you before.
Yeah.
But now you know, you've gotten past the initial horror or the initial kind of abject disgustingness of it, and you can see how funny something is. And I think that's, you know, what makes this movie and, you know, all of his movies, except maybe Dune. I don't know. People have, it's polarizing, but you know, or like, you know, The Elephant Man isn't really a funny movie, but it's a brilliant movie. But
many of his many of his films definitely have that melodramatic thing to it, and like a lot of the times it's just in the performances. And I don't know what it is about David Lynch that he just brings these performances out of these actors. All the actors he's worked with, like, it's almost like everyone's on the same level. I noticed that even in the new series, the new Twin Peaks series, that everyone is just on the same vibe. It's like, and it's hard to explain, but when you're watching one of his films, you just know it. And so again, when people, like, when audiences laugh, I'm not really offended. I think, like, they're doing it in the nature that that it should be done. You know, like,
exactly,
because sometimes it is just so over the top, and some of it is just intense. Like, I find a lot of Blue Velvet actually hard to watch.
Absolutely.
Because it is so intense. But then so I think it's also like a relief for an audience. I think
you need those moments.
You kind of need, to laugh at something. You need to, and there are, like, Dennis Hopper in that movie is so funny, but also so scary. So scary at the same time, which plays into what we're discussing. Actually, if the mix of camp and horror.
If we have time for two little anecdotes, you know, one is more of just a general David Lynch thing, and the other, they're both kind of general David Lynch things, but I think the second is more related to Eraserhead. So the first, you know, because I don't know if we're ever going to get to talk about just Blue Velvet, although it seems to come up all the time anyway. But my dad told me that when he saw the movie for the first time, right when it came out in theaters, he was living in Los Angeles at the time, and he watched the movie, and as soon as the lights came up, Dennis Hopper was sitting right in front of him and turned around and put his hand over his face and goes, "Don't fucking look at me," which I think is just the coolest.
Are you serious?
Like, he was like imitating his character, so that's just a cool anecdote.
God. That's amazing.
In regards to,
did he have a Pabst in his hand, like a Pabst Blue Ribbon, or?
I don't know. I don't think so, but that would have been terrific. But the other thing is, it was a piece of writing that I read a while ago. It's in David Foster Wallace's collection of essays. You know, at risk of sounding like a literary / film bro, it was in David Foster Wallace's collection of essays, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. And there's a great essay he wrote, basically where he tracked David Lynch on the set of Lost Highway. He was invited, I think, by David Lynch, or hired by a publication, but I would imagine on a David Lynch set you have to be invited on. So he was definitely there on purpose to basically follow David Lynch around and do a profile on him while he was making Lost Highway. And so it's a really fascinating piece of writing for any Lynch fanatics out there, or David Foster Wallace people. Must read. Yeah, it's great. But one thing he was talking about that always stuck with me when we're talking about the performances David Lynch gets is that David Foster Wallace made a very astute observation, which is that all characters in David Lynch films are possessed. Not possessed in the sense that they are overcome by a ghost or some kind of entity, but that they just have this kind of determination and behavioral quality that it's like something is living inside them that is making them behave a certain way that is outside of the norm, but because they're all possessed, because every single person there is possessed, we just accept it as the reality. And that has always really stuck with me. And I find myself, whenever I'm watching a horror movie, to bring it back to that, I think about that idea of possession. And, like I said, not possession in terms of, is it a ghost, is it The Conjuring, but possession in terms of, is the movie possessed? Do these characters just flawlessly integrate into the situation and become overcome by it? How much are they living in the horror? And does the movie possess us as an audience? Are we possessed by the movie? Are we so drawn in that we're held on to it? And I don't know. So that's just always stuck with me, and is a thing that I find myself thinking about constantly. And I think that there's maybe no better example of a possessed David Lynch movie than Eraserhead.
Yeah, possession. That explains it. I think, that's a good way to look at it. Because there's something that makes it all work, and I think that's what it is. Again, it's like everyone is on that same level. And it all started with Eraserhead, really. And so, I think that's the one to go back to see where this all began. And the short films before that, of course. So there's a lot to discuss. I still can't believe that Dennis Hopper thing. Where was your dad? So where was the theater at? Where was it?
I can ask him. I could try texting him right now, and we can put it in the show notes.
I would guess like New York or LA or.
It was in LA. He was living in LA in the 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's amazing. We talked about Dennis Hopper a lot on the show too.
Yeah. Well,
So he's always a character in his own right. He was possessed by something, I think. Anyway.
His entire life.
One big possession.
Yeah.
So Jeremy, we wanted to talk about. It's October. It's Halloween, spooky time. We wanted to talk about something horror related. We're both huge horror fans, and I'm glad that we decided on doing this series because I think it's really interesting, and there's a lot of films coming up that we want to talk about, not just Eraserhead, even though we gushed about that for however long this was, but there is another film we're going to discuss next time, and that's going to be Jacob's Ladder, which, speaking of nightmarish imagery, that has a lot of it, and just we're going to be talking about a lot of films like that, which are horrific but also cult films and not really horror films. So that's what we're going with, and I'm excited to talk about it, and a lot of good films coming up, but thank you for joining us for this one. Jeremy, did you have any closing comments about Eraserhead or David Lynch or anything? Or
no,
Dennis Hopper?
I hope I hope if for anyone, if this is your first David Lynch movie that you've watched, and that we were able to kind of help provide some insight into our fanaticism, and that you are compelled to go explore the rest of his body of work, because he's really a one-of-a-kind filmmaker, and now
you're really part of the cult. Now you have to go watch all of his movies.
Love it or hate it. If you love movies, he's
now
worth
now you're possessed.
Now you're possessed.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of my favorites, and he's one of my favorites, David Lynch. So glad we finally got to talk about Jeremy. Yay! Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to Cult Movie Cult, and you can find us on all the social medias, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.